Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on how to craft captivating apps with the Power Platform in 2024. We are in each other's company for the next 35 minutes or so, and I'm really excited to showcase what it means to create a beautiful and functional app, and hopefully we'll give you some great insight into how that all works and what value it can bring to your organization. As most of you know, my name is Sam Cooper. I'm the head of marketing here at Changing Social, and with me today I have my wonderful colleague and head of digital platforms, Aaron Gums, who you will meet in just a moment. I will drop both of our emails in the chat for you now, and please do feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. And finally, I will be monitoring the Q&A for you today as well. So a quick note about housekeeping before we get started. So if you would like to see live captions during this webinar, please turn the feature on using the settings icon, then choose captions/subtitles from the list. You will then have an opportunity to select your preferred language for those captions there. You are also invited to ask questions during this webinar, and this can be done by selecting the chat icon, then selecting the box shown Ask a Question, then type in your question and choose whether you'd like to add your name or ask anonymously, and send it by selecting the send option, as shown as the paper aeroplane. And as mentioned, we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. So today we are going to be focusing on the history of apps, getting into the nitty and gritty with that one, the types of Power Apps that you can create, what good looks like, and then finally that Q&A at the end. Now on to the team. So Aaron leads our Power Platform practice and has overseen projects with teams in the UK, Europe, and the US, so catering to solutions from anywhere between 5 to 10,000 plus users. So under his leadership, clients have benefited from over 25 years of combined experience in M365 and the Power Platform. So now that I've told you a little bit about Aaron, I just want to give you a little bit of information around Changing Social. So as most of you know, we are a Microsoft partner focusing on the people side of digital transformation. We transform organizations through world-class automation and change management strategies to help you realize the full capabilities of Microsoft 365. Our mission is to prove value in days, not months, by identifying and prioritizing quick wins through actionable plans and simplicity for your colleagues. But for now, I will pass over to Aaron to get us started with today's session.
Thank you very much, Sam. So as Sam mentioned a moment ago, before we start looking at applications and what makes a good application, we're just going to step back a little bit and talk about the history of apps, in quotes. Many years ago, apps was a term that people didn't really consider as a part of their daily vocabulary, but now today it's something that we all understand and that we all use from a very early age. And that transition has really happened since the late 90s. So some of you will remember, some of you might not be old enough to remember, that there used to be several applications on some of the first generation mobile phones that were starting to give additional communication functionality. And they tended to be in the form of very simple games like Snake, for example, probably the most popular mobile game that was first invented. As we started to see different pieces of functionality kind of introduced to these phone capabilities, whether that was the traditional type of phone that we had before smartphones or whether it was smartphones today, the sophistication and complexity of those applications has changed. So we really started to see apps take off in their current format around 2007 with the launch of the iPhone. And that tended to be applications that were within the first touchscreen phones. The idea was that you could change the capability of what you see on the screen, whether that's adding new buttons, adding new interface conventions and features by using the software rather than using hardware. So there was a lot more flexibility for the developers, but equally a lot more feedback to the end users as well. Then we started to move swiftly on. So in 2008, we saw the first iterations of the concept of app stores from Android and from Apple. And within those two major areas, we saw primarily games to start off with, some gimmicks as well, such as applications that could simulate a lighter and things like that, or drinking beer. But then we started to see the app stores come up with some really serious capabilities, such as increasing productivity whilst you're on the go. using some smaller devices to carry out quick actions that you might traditionally need to do behind a desk, but being able to do that without disrupting the flow of what else you're doing in your daily life, instead of effectively going back to work, in quotes. And then if we fast forward to today, we see the kind of complexity and sophistication that we get in power apps. With enterprise scale applications that allow us to carry out business both on the desktop and on mobile, with complete customization and configuration to suit our business needs, as well as everything else that we associate with applications in our personal life, such as games and social media. Now, the use of apps and the kind of concept of an app hasn't really changed over that time. But what has changed are these four kind of key areas that sit around the development of an application. So when we're thinking about audience, now if you think about where we started with applications and where we are today, an app used to be commonly associated just with personal life. It was games, it was social media, or trivial things like calculators, or watching YouTube. As we look at applications today, they can do absolutely everything across both personal and business related data as well. When we think about the type of developer that is developing these applications now compared to back then, we've seen the introduction of this concept of a citizen developer, as well as a professional developer that would work in IT. Now, we used to look at applications as something that everybody would use and they would fulfill a generalized purpose. But now we see apps for all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some applications will do things very well and they will fulfill one use case. We'll see other applications that will have like a catch-all approach to be used by the general public, or across the whole team if we're working in business. And then, as we've already mentioned a few times so far, the complexity of those applications have changed as well. So we saw on the left-hand side of the previous slide a very simple interface, which was simulating a snake capturing some food. But now we have all sorts of features and user interface functions that we can use to make our apps more intuitive, but also more complex. Now, although purpose is there on the screen, nothing to say there specifically about purpose in isolation. I think that's kind of covered by all of those things that we've spoken about so far. Moving from personal to business application, changing the type of people that are developing, as well as the type of people that are consuming the application, and also the complexity as well. So that's just a little bit about the history of apps. Now let's go specifically to Power Apps in detail. Now, we have two types of Power Apps that you may already be familiar with. We have the model-driven application, and we also have the Canvas application. Now, the model-driven app, as it's called, is something that was built based on a product that already existed on-premise from Microsoft. So we had this terminology that we used to use called CRM, which is Customer Relationship Management. And Microsoft had an application that used to carry out that function. Now, when that moved from on-premise to on the cloud, and then we started to see the introduction of the Power Platform, we saw the interface that was previously used just for the CRM application become a flexible thing that we could now control. So from around 2016, we saw model-driven apps in the form that they are today, where you could customize your own sitemap using only configuration practices. And we could also have our custom tables on that sitemap and really tailor the user experience to the individual. But the other concepts that you see within a model-driven app, such as the dashboard or the lists or the views and the forms, those things have been around right from the beginning of the CRM product. That has evolved since 2011 or so, maybe a little bit before, depending on what version you're talking about. When it comes to the Canvas application, so this is the newest type of Power App, and it's the thing that people most commonly associate the term Power App with. This started to kind of surface in 2013. We saw hints of Canvas apps becoming a flexible canvas around the 2013 mark, but really we had the ability to fully customize the interface in this way at around 2016. And the reason I say that there's kind of those two key dates as milestones is because within 2013, they really started to look at potentially splitting the data model from the user interface, whereas in 2016 they fully introduced the idea of a custom Power App that could do whatever you want effectively. So just to compare the two types of Power Apps, we have model driven. It's the one that we think about when we think about critical path business processes, looking at thousands of records in one view that we're able to filter in an Excel-like way. It's also the one that we think about when we're looking at Dataverse as a product, so enterprise scale systems, and also potentially integrating a website front end, which could be implemented via Power Pages. On the other hand, we have the Canvas application, which has a completely customizable interface. So when you start building a Canvas app, you really do start with a blank screen compared to a model-driven app. It's better for users on the go, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail very soon. But also, it connects to thousands of data sources natively by using the Power Platform connectors that we have available to us. Depending on what connectors you're using, it can also use existing licensing, which is a huge benefit to people getting started. And also it uses an Excel-like language for programming. So very different contrasting kind of approaches to developing those two different types of applications there. But also, as you can see, the audience and purpose, potentially the complexity as well, will differ for both type of applications. When we talk about what good looks like in terms of an application today, we're going to focus on the Canvas app side of things because that's where we have the complete control over the user interface. But these types of tips can be applied to any type of application, really. So what does good look like when we're focusing on Canvas apps and also other applications where we can control the user interface? So to start off with, we should think about using visual indicators. So one of the things that we mentioned earlier, comparing model-driven apps to Canvas apps, is that model-driven apps have a really good way of handling large volumes of data on the screen. Now, Canvas apps can be good at handling large volumes of data, but there are some limitations around the number of pieces of data that you can retrieve at any given time. And also because of the type of users that are using the system, which we're going to talk about very soon, can differ compared to the type of people that sit behind a desk. It's not always appropriate just to show lists of data on a screen. It could alienate the end user and it could distract from the core purpose of the application. So using visual indicators is always key. If you want to be able to search for users, use search icons or add prompt text into the search bar. If you need to be able to show things like public versus private, so visibility, maybe we could be using emojis. Instead of using words such as view or see more, we could always use an icon that's commonly associated with open links, which would be the kind of chain emoji that we have, but also the globe emoji as well. So you can start to use visual indicators to portray information without having to show text across your screen for all of those different things. Now, if we have a look at the example that we have on the screen here, I've implemented some of these in an internal app that we're using. So the purpose of this application is to allow us to see the different users that we have in our Active Directory, and then also display the groups that we're showing to or we're associating with that individual. Now, as you can see here on the left-hand side, we have this green and red dot against those two users. That's a visual indicator to me to say this person is or is not an active employee. So I have my daily account, which is associated with our operation system, and I have my admin account that's not associated with the operation system. It's just used for global admin tasks. Now, I could have used text to say this person is an active employee and they're in the operation system. That's quite a lot of words, but because I know the audience of this application and it's very easy for them to understand what that is, I just need a little dot in the corner of the list to be able to tell me that. As I said earlier, we could use indicators to denote things such as public and private for visibility. I've done that on this application here, but I've also got an icon to tell me if there is a mailbox associated with the group on the right hand side as well. And to make the button a little bit smaller, instead of seeing view all, I think it's 7 times across the screen, we've just got the globe emoji there, so I can click on it and it will open up a link for me in a new browser window. So if you imagine all of those visual indicators being taken away from that screen and replacing those with text, it would be a completely different user interface experience for the end user. The next one is environmental factors. So especially when you're building Canvas apps, you need to think about the type of user that's going to be using your solution. So for example, is your person going to be a driver who's primarily working in a van? They need to inspect the vehicle, they need to do lots of drop-offs. Their primary purpose in the organization is not to be using an application, but actually to do something else functional. Now, in those scenarios where you're not quite sitting behind a desk, we need to think about the user interface that we're going to be creating for them. You know, if you're sitting behind a desk, it's really easy for you to use Excel-like features for 2 reasons. The first one is that you have a mouse, so you have precision on the screen. The second one is that you're probably familiar with other technical-based tools such as Excel filters to be able to manage your data. If you're someone where you're on the road, you're not sitting behind the desk, your primary focus in the role, as we call it, frontline worker. It's not to be behind a desk using this technology all of the time. First of all, I need to be able to use this app intuitively, but I also need to be able to use it in the environment that I'm in. So with a Canvas app, we have the flexibility to, for example, add really big buttons so that if people were using gloves or they're kind of throwing their phone about as they're getting in the van or getting out of the van and things like that, big green buttons, big red buttons, just give me the function that I need to be able to use to operate my process, and then make it really easy for me to be able to do that as quickly as possible so I can carry on with my core role. Another example is what we have on the screen here. So taking the scenario of someone who drives a van, they do a lot of pickups and drop-offs, and they just need to be able to see their routes that have been assigned to them. Now, for an end user who was sitting behind a desk, you might be able to give them a list of all routes in a table, and then give them the opportunity to filter those routes using Excel-like filters. For someone in a van, primarily because you don't want to have to keep training them every time they use the application, and you want it to be intuitive, but also for speed as well. You might present that filter in quotes as 2 different buttons. So you might have the same data that you're displaying to them, but actually you say my routes or all routes as almost 2 different screens, as opposed to a filter on one screen with more data. Also, when we're considering environmental factors, think about the speed of being able to enter data primarily, not just the navigation of the application as well. Now, thinking about our desk-based user, we have the ability to quickly copy and paste using keyboard shortcuts. We have the ability to type really fast because we often have a physical keyboard. And also our environment is always very, very predictable. Our desk is always set up in exactly the same way. Now, if I'm an end user who is constantly moving around, I'm potentially using a touchscreen, and the pace of my work is a lot quicker because I'm moving around and speaking to people face to face and typing as I'm going and things like that. we want to make sure that the data entry part of this is as quick as possible. So using categorizations and using shortcuts to allow pre-population of data can really help as well. So as you can see on the screen here in this example, which is the same application that we just saw on the previous screen, you can see that every single field there, apart from latitude and longitude, is a drop down. So they can tap once and tap their selection. And then to find their location, they don't have to free text the latitude and longitude. They just need to click the find location button to automatically populate it. Now, to be able to enter all of this detail about a defect on the vehicle, they have to do potentially 6 taps to fill in the first 3 fields, and then 1 tap to fill in the find location. So 7 taps in total to enter all of that data. Now, if I was a customer service agent that was taking a phone call about a vehicle defect, you may not necessarily present that information in the same way, and they might be typing a lot more free text, but they also have the environment to be able to do that. Next up, branding and use of color. So with branding and use of color, this can fulfill 2 different functions that we're going to talk about. So the first one is making sure that the solution feels like it's a part of the business and that it's also consistent with the other solutions and applications that you have across the business. And the second part is also going back to visual indicators as well. So making sure that the colors match the kind of psychology of how the user is going to use the application, which we're going to talk about more in a second. I didn't have an example that I wanted to show you in the application on the screen just for this one, but I did want to take a screenshot of a tool that we use in my Power Platform team called PowerToys. So PowerToys is a free application from the Microsoft Store. It's created by Microsoft as well, and it allows you to take any value from a color on your screen and it presents it in the technical terms required to implement that color in your application. You can also set up your own syntax and conventions as well. So as you can see on that first line that starts the word power, that's a little configuration that we've done in the settings to make sure it presents the RGBA code that you would commonly use in Power Apps. So if I want to take the exact yellow from the Changing Social logo or the exact color from any other brand, I can click a keyboard shortcut, which I believe is Control, Windows key and C. And with PowerToys installed, it will give me a little widget to show me a tool picker. And once I've selected the color, it will pop up all of this wealth of information here. We tend to use this all the time, primarily with branding, but also to make sure that we can get the right kind of color palette so that all of the colors that we use either contrast or complement each other. Now, speaking more a little bit about color and talking about indicators, but also a couple of other themes as well. When we're implementing effectively the mode of the application, so light mode or dark mode, it's often better to use off black or off white tones when you're building your application. It just takes the harshness off the application when someone's viewing it on a very bright screen. That's applicable to any color that you're using in your application. So kind of what I would call full red. So in RGB 25500, you would kind of dial down that tone a little bit to make it less harsh, as you can see on the failure notification down the bottom of this slide, just to make sure that you're not kind of alarming your user too much or making it difficult for them to read in certain screen settings. Now, the other thing to consider is always use the kind of colors that you would commonly associate for different types of information. We'll talk a little bit more about following conventions in a moment, but what I mean by that is making sure that the visual aspect of your application is predictable. So it sounds obvious when I say it like this, but for example, you don't want to be using greens or blues for failures. You don't want to be using reds and oranges for successes. You know, the common colors that you would expect for information, warning, success and failure are blue, yellow, green and red respectively. And we should make sure that we follow those conventions so that we require less training when we're building the application. Next up Following conventions. So as I just said there, making sure that your application is predictable in certain ways. If you've been to one of my previous webinars, which I think was around increasing personal productivity, we spoke about this concept of not reinventing the square wheel. And what we mean is, don't try to build something that someone else has already built and where they've built it quite well. And that applies to building applications as a whole, whether that's the visual aspect, whether it's the function, and all that kind of stuff. Now, when we're talking about application building and following conventions, we're talking about making sure that color focuses the attention in the right way, making sure that color adds value. So for example, in this application on the screen, green denotes that the person will be in the location that they've said they'll be in, but the red denotes that they won't be in that location on that day for one reason or another. Making sure that that color adds value. We could add a border to each one of those profile pictures that was just the changing social yellow. That could imply to other people that there's something wrong with that profile picture. So maybe they think that person's not going to be in that location, but also it doesn't necessarily add any value to the screen that we're looking at either. The other one, which is not so obvious, is making sure that you follow happy paths and negative paths. So if you want a user to carry out a particular action and you want to force them to a particular direction, make sure that that flow is from top left to bottom right. So anything that is, submitting data or, leaving this screen to go somewhere else once you've consumed the information, you want those kind of actions to start flowing towards the bottom right of the screen. And that will just naturally follow the same kind of psychological way of reading the information that we would, particularly in the Western world anyway, when we're navigating these applications. Equally, if you want to carry out a negative action, then it's better to try and disrupt the flow, because then the user has to consciously think about doing that thing and making sure that action is correct. So, when you're thinking about cancelling something, you might want to put that button over in the bottom left instead, because you don't naturally follow the information to the bottom left of the screen. Equally, that's where you might want to add pop-ups to the screen as well. And last but not least, thinking about how other conventions in other applications work. So generally speaking, when you're looking at an application, you'll always have the title at the top in the center. You'll then potentially have your filters kind of in that next row within the canvas or within the application, so that you can start to sort and manipulate your data. And then you'll have your main content area before any actions at the bottom. And then finally, just thinking about the structure of your applications. Now, this is relatively subjective, but if you follow some of the rules that we've spoken about previously and you start to compartmentalize your app design, you should end up with something that looks fairly similar to what we have on the screen here. So as you can see, we have navigation on the left-hand side that kind of follows that left-hand edge all the way down. We then have the opportunity for a logo, a header, and a profile picture across that kind of top header area. We then have the main content area in the middle, taking up the majority of the space. And we also have the actions that sit at the bottom as well. Now, if you have this kind of psychological thought process around the structure of all of your applications following that same convention, then every time you deploy a new application in the business, there will always be an element of familiarity in the application and also less training that's required to use the application. So thinking about those almost invisible lines in the way that you develop your app and keeping that consistent can be really key as well. And that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover with you today. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to hand back over to Sam.
Great, thanks, Aaron, for that session. That was awesome. So we don't have any questions at the moment, but what I'll do, Aaron, is I'll wrap up and we'll see if we get any questions during the last minute or so. Just a reminder, if you do have any other questions that you'd like to take offline, please do email either myself or Aaron, and we will be happy to assist. So if you are interested in a more sort of free, tailored Power App discovery call with our team, then please do book a meeting with us using the link in the chat that I've just posted. But if we don't have any questions, I can take that as a conclusion for today's webinar. So thank you very much for your time today and for being so engaging with us. We really do appreciate it. So on that note, from myself and Aaron, have a wonderful day wherever you are. We hope you found this webinar useful, and thanks again for your time. Bye-bye.